We're going to turn to the international newspapers now here on France 24. Elena with us on set as ever. We've been talking a lot in the last few days about the deaths of the Coptic Christians, the clashes going in Cairo, and the Guardian, UK's Guardian, has a lot of different opinions on this one, doesn't it?
Yes, they've got two quite strongly contrasting viewpoints in different columns in the same paper. So if we look first at the piece by writer William Dalrymple, who's written a book on the role of Christians in the Middle East, or rather the challenges that they face. Now he says that violence at the weekend was the sign of rising Islamic sectarianism in Egypt. He says the Coptic Christians have already suffered centuries of discrimination, and one of the main things that the government should be doing now is trying to crack down on any sectarian attacks towards them. They say there's a growing Islamist sentiment on the streets that's reflected by the political popularity of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's something the government should really be watching out for. They say lots of Copts backed the Mubarak government until the very last minute because they were afraid that if he fell it would lead to this kind of sectarian clashes, and as a result some of them have been pinpointed as enemies of the revolution by some political groups, and therefore it's a sectarian conflict that's going on here. He sees the army, the Egyptian army, in this as more or less neutral, whereas the Guardian's actual editorial takes a very different point of view. They say that actually the idea of a sectarian conflict was a smokescreen created by the army to cover up what was essentially the army cracking down on protesters, very much in the same way as it did under Mubarak, under emergency rule. They say state television encouraged Muslims to go out onto the streets and, well, at least counter-demonstrate, if not attack against those Christian protesters. They were protesting, of course, about an arson attack on a church, but they say the Egyptian army exploited those divisions in order to create a screen for them to attack demonstrators.
And more religious difficulties in the next story. Countdown starting to Tunisia's first democratic elections. The Washington Post, they're worried about the Islamist influence there.
Yes, now Tunisia isn't culturally, traditionally a terribly strictly Islamic state. It's not a country where women frequently wear veils, for example, and yet the Washington Post says all the political parties running in Tunisia's first post-Ben Ali democratic election on October the 23rd have been producing election posters and material showing veiled women candidates and trying to proclaim their faith everywhere. Even the famously secular Communist Party is doing that. They say that the gap left in Tunisian politics when Ben Ali's RCD was taken apart, that was, of course, the dominating political party in Tunisia for decades, and the gap that it's left has been filled by political Islam, they say. And, well, if they're moderate groups, that's not necessarily worrying in itself. What might be worrying is that the only non-Islamic opposition parties that are springing up in Tunisia seem to be made up of former cronies of Ben Ali's who are trying to see this as a re-entrance back into politics. So the Washington Post says we should be keeping an eye on what's going on in Tunisia.
Indeed we should. Now, also looking at Liberia, the Nobel Peace Prize doesn't win you an election, apparently.
No, absolutely not. It might even tell against Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in her election race coming up this week. The New York Times has been there, and they say that not only has she not been mentioning it on the campaign trail and trying to play it down as much as possible, her opponents are using it against her, saying that she feels that international recognition means that she doesn't need to worry about what the Liberian people actually think of her. And of course, as we heard in the bulletin, there's 80% unemployment there and some quite severe social problems, even 8 years after the end of their civil war. They also talk to Africa experts who say it's actually patronising and colonialist of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee to award it to her when she's coming up to an election. It makes it look like they know better than African voters who they should be voting for.
And we're going back to religion for this last story, but rather in a different way, I'd say. Pulled out a story in The Guardian.
Yes, what did the Romans do for us, Stuart?
Roads.
Yes, they also created the inspiration for one of the greatest British comedy films ever, I'm sure you'll all agree. The Life of Brian, of course, where this comes from, the dramatisation of the life of Jesus. Now, the filmmaker Terry Jones, the Python, has told The Guardian in an interview today he doesn't believe he can make that film today because the religious lobby has grown so much in power, he doesn't believe you could distribute it.
I think he's probably right, I have to say, but yeah, it's a good film.
He did face blasphemy charges at the time, if you remember, but they were sort of rubbished generally. But I think it's interesting to see that if the religious lobby has grown since 1979, it's not what I would have thought, but he does.
Oh well, the views there of Terry Jones. Thanks very much, Elena, there with the international papers here on France 24.